Madam President, in 2005, May of that year, the Senate faced a crisis that seems very familiar and very much like the one we face today in this body. Very simply, the Senate was unable to approve judges, which threatened to incapacitate a co-equal branch of our government, the United States judiciary. And it confronted the threat of what came to be called the nuclear option, a change in the rules that would have wrecked the collegiality and civility that has characterized this body. Members of both parties recognized that the situation was untenable, and they recognized as well that the American court system was too important for the Senate to simply stop approving judges and suspend that very important constitutional responsibility on behalf of this body. At the time, 14 senators came together to find a solution. They came to be known as the Gang of 14, 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. And I want to read their names for the record because I think their conduct here characterized what is really perhaps best about this institution. They were Senators Robert Byrd of West Virginia, Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island, Susan Collins of Maine, Mike DeWine of Ohio, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut, John McCain of Arizona, Ben Nelson of Nebraska, Mark Pryor of Arizona, Ken Salazar of Colorado, Olympia Snowe of Maine, and John Warner of Virginia. And what they devised was a quite simple solution. They were grappling with the same question that confronts us now. What can justify a member of the United States Senate voting to block consideration? In other words, to filibuster a nominee to the judicial branch. And their idea, simple as it was, had tremendous power. They agreed they would oppose a judicial nominee only in, quote, extraordinary circumstances. That was the gist of the agreement. There were other features to it, but their spirit and intent in this short phrase had profoundly meaningful impact. In fact, for the remainder of the Bush presidency, there were no more filibusters on judicial nominees. And those senators, with that short phrase, accomplished a historic impact. What did they mean by it? As one of them said at the time, quote, ideological attacks are not an extraordinary circumstance. It would have to be a character problem, an ethics problem, some allegations about the qualifications of a person, not an ideological bent, end quote. An ethics problem, a character problem, some allegations about the qualifications of a person. Today, Madam President, I ask for a renewed and revived commitment to the spirit of that agreement, a reinvigorated effort to apply that standard and offer to work with my colleagues to revive that spirit of opposing a nominee and blocking that individual only in an extraordinary circumstance. And I come to the floor today because we have heard objections to a number of nominees on the basis of claims that clearly cannot constitute an extraordinary circumstance. Opposed through that 60-vote threshold, the filibuster just last week, were a couple of nominees that clearly had qualifications to serve on the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. I rise in support today of another, Cornelia Pillard. Whatever has been said about this process, we have heard no extraordinary circumstance to oppose any of these nominees, and certainly not Ms. Pillard. Senators can always disagree about exactly what our courts should do and how we should divide and allocate resources. And the claim has been made here that the reason to oppose those nominees is that there is insufficient workload to justify them. The fact of the matter is that this Congress has approved the positions that are vacant and that they have been nominated to fill. I know that a lot of my colleagues have opinions on how to structure the court and what the workloads should be. But I would assume that these differences of opinion do not amount to extraordinary circumstances. They happen all the time. We debate what the workloads of the court should be. And certainly, the job of this Senate and of every senator is to advise and consent on judicial nominations. If we refuse to consider the qualifications of a nominee, and if we make the judgment based on irrelevant consideration, we're failing to advise and consent. We can debate about the structure and the workload and the number of cases before a court, but they are not extraordinary circumstances. And the fact of the matter is that the workload of this court well justifies these nominations. In fact, it has grown in number since nominees were last approved. The waiting time for decisions on cases makes it 8th out of the 12 circuit courts. The cases themselves can't be judged only by the numbers, by the sheer volume of the caseload. The Senate, in my view, has to look also to the complexity and difficulty of the cases. I've argued before this circuit court, and I've participated in cases like the Microsoft appeal, which took months, in fact years, to resolve from start to finish, and involved precedential setting issues and decisions by the circuit court, and literally hours of argument. So the argument, in my view, about workload and about the need to fill or leave vacant, as the opponents say, that those vacancies is incorrect and wrong. And agreeing with me are the Judicial Conference and a majority of their colleagues who also say the vacancies should be filled, as do judges from across the political spectrum and appointees of a lot of different presidents. But the point here is that disagreement, or even the claim that the workload doesn't justify it, is not an extraordinary circumstance, and that ought to be the standard, consistent with the Gang of 14's agreement. Now, I happen to believe that Cornelia Pillard is almost the ideal nominee. If you were to design someone, if you had that ability on the basis of record and talent and temperament, I don't think you could do much better. The DC court is said to be the second highest court in the country. I think they are all the second highest court. I don't think any one of them is better than the other. And by the way, I don't think that the decisions are more difficult in one circuit necessarily for judges than another. But what we want is an individual in each of these judgeships who is worthy of the immense responsibility, because for most litigants, the circuit court is the last stop on the litigation course. And Nina Pillard brings to this nomination not only brilliance in an academic sense, but a variety of experience and a record of thoughtful engagement with diverse views, a dedication to excellence and to public service. She has spent time in the classrooms as well as the courtrooms, and she is a civil rights hero as well as a public servant and an expert on the judicial system. In other words, if you had to design someone with a record and experience that is ideal for this court or any of the other circuit courts, you would pick Nina Pillard. Now, I'm going to come back to the floor. I'm going to speak about her. I'm going to speak about this court. I'm going to speak about the Gang of 14. And I'm going to speak about what should justify blocking a nominee of the President of the United States to serve in the courts. But for now, let me just say about her, I hope that my colleagues will listen to her qualifications, to listen to her story, and listen to the better angels of their nature. The present situation cannot stand, and if we continue on the present course, we will arrive at the same juncture that existed in May of 2005 when the Gang of 14 helped to save the Senate from a crisis. It would have been a crisis for the collegiality and civility of this institution. It would have been also a crisis for the country. And I hope that we can again avoid it if we permit this process to move forward and recognize that there is no extraordinary circumstance for any of these nominees that should block their approval by the United States Senate. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.